I've been a college reporter, lived abroad as a teacher, worked the Mandarin mission for the Navy, the NSA, rode submarines, researched for corporate law, and consulted for major defense contractors. But lately, the one experience I find myself leveraging more than the others is my recent experience as a J6er. I've criticized the sedition hunters for avoiding the topic of current and past BLM and Antifa violence, despite the fact that it's extremely relevant in the defense of what happened for us that day in January 2021. I'm the one who thinks it's relevant, so I feel I must once more examine how the conservative protesters acted during that 4-hour protest and compare it with what's been going on for months now in these anti-ICE protests being run by the establishment left. It's very much an establishment operation, by the way. In particular, I'd like to once again bring up the whole pitchfork incident. I've touched on this before, but in case you haven't heard it, here's the quick and dirty. At the U.S. Capitol, there was a door that was locked. It was leading up to one of the 4 stairs that went up to the West Terrace. When it was unlocked, I was the first one through. When I went through, the first thing I saw on the ground was a pitchfork, which I believed at that time was staged. Not knowing what to do with the situation, I quickly decided that if I didn't pick it up and take care of it, I might regret having ignored it. So I picked it up and I carried it. I had a pitchfork in one hand and a flagpole with the Donald Trump sign or flag on it in the other hand, which I also picked up because I was afraid it was going to be a tripping hazard. And I walked up the stairs. And I go up the stairs and you can kind of see it. You kind of can't. The footage is very fuzzy digitally. It's very pixelated. So the flag you can see because it's big. The pitchfork is really hard to see, but if you know it's there, you can find it. So that's basically what happened there. And seriously, I have no idea who put it there or where it went after the fact. But what I ended up doing with it is working with other protesters to get it secured from the premises. And basically, no one anywhere was hurt that day with a pitchfork, protester or cop. So it took me a while to figure out what to do with the pitchfork. You can see in the video how I start going towards the tunnel, which is up at the top of the stairs on the West Terrace. And that's where all the cops were. And I thought, okay, I'm former intel, right? So I did TSSCI Special Access Program missions for the NSA and the United States Navy. And that made me a SIGINTer. So HUMINTers are the human intelligence people. They're professional liars, right? That's their job in life. SIGINTers are completely different, right? So to become a SIGINTer, to have access to that level of information, you have to have like a radical devotion to the truth. You have to be like Johnny squared away, always telling the truth. You never lie about anything. You obey all the regulations. You obey all the commands. You're a good boy, right? You're maxed out on good boy points. That's what it means to be a SIGINTer, signals intelligence. So knowing this, you can infer that what I wanted to do first when I got that pitchfork was to hand it over to the cops. But here I am. I'm, like 6'2". I had really long hair. I had a crazy beard at the time. And I thought, if I walk holding a pitchfork to the cops, say, hey, I'm going to give this to you, lumbering up the stairs. And so in my imagination, I realized very quickly that could end horribly. So I didn't do that. So that could have gone really wrong. I realized the cops would have every right to basically shoot me before I even got halfway up the stairs, because it just would have been a very threatening and odd situation. Here I am approaching them with a weapon, and maybe they won't be able to hear me or whatever. If they had shot me, they would have been within their rights, arguably. But then you would have had a protester bleeding out on the steps of the Capitol just when that protest is getting started. Now, keep in mind, at this point, hardly anyone knew anything that happened with Ashley Babbitt. So we had an idea. Some of us, like I had been told in a phone call that I received that I could barely hear because of the noise that Ashley Babbitt had been shot. But I said, no person here has been shot. That's crazy. That's fake news. I didn't know. What they were telling me is that it was a different group of people on the inside. it was impossible to know that at the time. But a person bleeding out on the Capitol steps would have been a very theatrical, a very impressive image, and it would have definitely have exacerbated the situation. So, seeing this probable turn of events in my mind, I decided against trying to hand the pitchfork over to the cops, even though it left me holding, in the middle of a very emotional protest, carrying a conspicuous weapon I desperately didn't want to have in my hands. So, the recent anniversary of January 6th is a time of high emotion and very mixed feelings, and you can probably tell that from my writings that I've done over these past 2 weeks. The week of this most recent anniversary had a lot in store, though. On the anniversary of January 6th, on Tuesday, the Democrats went into a high dudgeon, bemoaning the insurrection that never was. And they relied on these tired and disproven talking points that an uncoordinated gaggle of unarmed protesters nearly toppled the world's greatest superpower in the span of 4 hours. So that was the mood of Democrats on Tuesday that week. On Wednesday, the very next day, the following day, the same people who screeched about insurrection by tourists were suddenly self-proclaimed experts in law of self-defense for law enforcement. On Tuesday, any conservative who looked funny at a DC Metro cop deserved life in prison. The next day, it became an inalienable right for every citizen to ignore police instruction, resist arrest, and run over any cops you want with an SUV. The waves of mental pain induced by this cognitive dissonance from this segment of the population practically gave me a migraine. The same chunk of people believe that both ideas are true. How do law enforcement go from sacred and untouchable pillars of the community one day and Stasi scourge the next? The good shooting and subsequent events where protesters taunted, jeers, impeded, and even hit law enforcement officers sent many conservatives back to their whiteboards. It was another event like the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination that had people seriously wondering what exactly happens in the mind of a leftist that makes them react in ways that are both counterintuitive and counterfactual. These are good questions to ask. One psychologist surmised that leftists suffer from 4 mental disorders. Yeah, the histrionic personality disorder, the narcissistic personality disorder, the antisocial personality disorder, and the borderline personality disorder. Another theory floated by a sci-fi author, Devin Erickson, posits that leftists have forsaken their humanity, essentially, by relinquishing personal agency in order to adopt the mental operations that mimic those of an LLM or language learning model used by AI, right? So LLMs are what make AI. They are programs that basically produce certain lifelike results and reactions based on massive amounts of training by processing whole reams of written information. As a result, these people, like the AI, don't understand objects in objective space-time the way the rest of us do. Erickson says, quote, "What I mean is that humans who are large language models," so he's basically saying people who think like this are living large language models, "do not have a robust world object model to counterweight their language model. They are able to manipulate symbols, sometimes adroitly, but they are on a far shakier ground when it comes to trying to imagine the objects those symbols represent." So there's kind of a disconnect in reality. He continues, this is a longer quote, "You cannot confront her," meaning, Renee Good, "with the logical inconsistencies in her worldview because her object model doesn't actually have any. It's not complex enough for that. The relevant parts of her world object model can be summed up as follows. I say, good thing. I get head pats and cookies from all the people like me. That model is simply not big enough or complicated enough to contain certain notions like self-defense or vehicular assault. She has no theory of mind for a man whose job includes violence. She cannot explain or predict his behavior. It is too far away from her daily experience to fit into her reality at all. And if she can't imagine things like these, how can she possibly manage concrete things for the vast and complex ideas like demographic replacement, culture shift, and Western civilization? It's not about intelligence or lack of it. Well, that's nice. This is about what her brain is trained to do. Her upbringing, education, and life did not force or even encourage her to develop a robust world object model. It wasn't necessary for her to get safety approval or cookies. She just had to be glib. So it really didn't matter if she had an IQ of 125 or whatever, because if she did, then she was just IQ 125 large language model and only used that brain capacity for writing clever poetry and saying things that aligned her to her local social matrix. She couldn't actually understand the world no matter how smart she was because her brain was trained up wrong. The model feels valid to me, right? So it helps understand why someone would make the types of choices that so clearly could lead to their doom. To put it simply, Good and her spouse didn't grasp the apparent outcome because their mental models could not accommodate reality. They were like someone walking around wearing VR goggles. What they were interacting in their virtual world wasn't what they were interacting with in real life. Some have noticed that after the shooting, Good's spouse asked why the cops had to use real bullets, as if she assumed that when an officer draws a firearm, he has a choice, like there's a setting, like it's a Star Trek phaser or something. This would support the idea that the two were fundamentally disconnected from reality. Like a child who jumps off his house wearing a cape thinking he can fly, they discovered really quick the disconnect between reality and mental construct. There are similar other theories that involve brainwashing or mass hypnosis. These are the types of exotic ideas I've entertained myself, although my preferred term is menticide. I have two problems with these models now. One is that they feel overly complex. Very simple things are being over-pathologized to rob leftists of a certain degree of their humanity by denying their rational minds and personal autonomy. The LLM model posits that these people have systematized their thought into unnatural processes, becoming little more than AI running on biological hardware. The personality disorder model only adds another disorder for each trait that cannot be attributed to the ones already evident, making it more of a pastiche than a qualified analysis. The other problem is that both models fail in their analysis to provide a clear method for dealing with the left. The attitude at the end is, wow, this is really bad. It's not like we can do anything about it, right? I'd like to add my own observation for consideration. This isn't a refutation of these other theories, which I think have their validity and their good points, but just what I noticed. I believe that Good and her spouse are liars, and it's their lies that got them into this situation. I believe that they understood the risks, but freely chose to do the things they did because they believed their actions would benefit in some way. The primary reason for this conclusion is that their version of events doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So if they're lying about the events, then they were lying about their motivations. Let's go back to J6. We'll compare it first with Venezuela. In order to take the insurrection side of the argument sincerely, you have to believe that a disorganized, uncoordinated, unarmed group of people who dejectedly left for their hotels by curfew in D.C. were more of a threat to the future of the republic than the Delta Force team that toppled the tiny dictatorship of Venezuela with space weapons. From the raid launch to the time Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima, roughly 4 to 5 hours elapsed. That's about the same amount of time the J6ers protested at the Capitol. But in Venezuela, it also took hundreds of planes, along with helicopters, drones, and a weapon that exists only in legend now. That's what it took to depose a tin pot dictator in Venezuela. Yet, according to leftists, I and my fellow protesters very nearly did the same thing to the United States without so much as a Snickers in my pocket. This is what I call the plot hole at the center of leftist J6 hysteria. It lies at the core of the government's justification for how it reacted to the event, and the reality revealed that it was merely a politically useful narrative. From that plot hole come various other narrative inconsistencies. The inaction on the pipe bomber is one that still hasn't been fully explained. Why didn't the FBI prioritize what was obviously a great threat? It was the greatest threat. It was the one bomb that was capable of causing destruction to more than one person. All right? It was a dangerous weapon. So it should have been prioritized. Prosecuting that mission should have been the highest priority. But instead, they diverted resources to picking up unarmed people like me who caused no damage or harm despite having been in a position to do so. I'll admit that I was in a position to do harm. Did I? No. You know the answer, and I know the answer. We don't need an explanation from the DOJ, no matter who's running it, to understand that this incongruous situation is in and of itself a clear indicator that the FBI was exaggerating the true impact we had on the government. It wasn't a true story. They knew it wasn't a true story. It was a useful story that they could leverage to justify rounding us up. It's a plot hole because the actions taken are inconsistent with the reasoning behind it. If I were a writer working on a story inspired by true events of January 6th, I would be forced to revise my story to iron out that pipe bomber detail because it doesn't make any sense. There are other plot holes in January 6th. One big point that drives our detractors so crazy is the fact that we were never asked to disperse until we were already leaving. Why did that order come so late? We believe that if the gathering was indeed declared unlawful around 3 p.m. as opposed to around 5 p.m., the majority of protesters would have dutifully complied with law enforcement and the event would have ended. Why did the police behind Ashley Babbitt take cover as she climbed through the window instead of putting her in cuffs? They could catch her after she was shot, but they couldn't pull her back to safety and put her in custody before she was shot? Why weren't the actions of the virtuous protesters rewarded? If the threat was actually real, why do we only hear about the protesters that dragged Michael Fanone out of the tunnel and not the other protesters who convinced him to holster his gun while telling other protesters around him to back off? Why didn't the protesters who quelled the crowd around Fanone and the ones who calmly backed off get recognition for saving officers, plural, because that situation happened more than once? Fanone wasn't the only one, honestly. So people didn't get recognition for saving those officers' lives if the scene was indeed so deadly to law enforcement as they say. They should be getting medals. Why did the DOJ have to invent a law to charge the protesters? Why did the judges go along with any of it? We're so used to calling leftists out on their hypocrisy that we lose sight of the fact that these aren't momentary lapses in self-awareness. They're plot holes. The mark of a sloppy writer, or whatever you want to call whoever it is that does the narratives for the left. They aren't confused, nor are they simply biased. They're deliberately misrepresenting facts to justify the actions they want to take. Renee and Rebecca Good were doing the same thing. There are, in fact, several plot holes in their versions of event. Plot hole number one, Trump is a dictator and ICE are his Gestapo. We all know that this is completely incongruous. If Trump were a dictator, he'd be making a sweep of the country to arrest his political opponents, like Biden did with us. Democrats may say this is the case, but their actions reveal a completely contrary understanding. No J6er violently resisted arrest by the FBI. We had guns and we had protein. If we wanted to resist at any number of levels of violence, we could have done so, but none of us did. Yet every leftist protester resists law enforcement or helps others to resist. That's the whole point of these protests, is to get these people out of the hands of ICE. J6ers acted consistently with the understanding that Biden was a tyrant. Leftists manifestly do not. The only conclusion is that they're lying for effect. Plot hole number two, Renee Good and her spouse were afraid of ICE, and both the command to drive and the subsequent action were the result of that fear. Manifestly untrue throughout the day, including up to the moment Good was shot. Their attitude towards police betrayed not fear, but defiance. They organized obstruction efforts. When directly approached and challenged, they brayed and taunted. They allowed their vehicle and plates and faces to be recorded. The reason people have such a hard time understanding their mindset is because their attitudes were so incongruous with the severity of the situation. Literally, no one who has watched the scene believes Good was afraid. And yet, by the time ICE approaches her vehicle and commands her to step out, she had already committed the same crime that I was convicted of, 18 U.S.C. 111, assaulting, resisting, or impeding officers or employees. When I was convicted of that crime, the prosecution wanted to put me away for 5 years. Pothole number three is Drive Baby Drive, having had their faces and plates recorded by federal law enforcement. There was literally nowhere in the country the couple could have gone to hide from the long arm of the law. Rebecca verbally acknowledged this fact as the ICE officer was recording her. At that point, both Renee and Rebecca knew that they could not hide. If that's the case, why did they step on the gas pedal? It's not confusion and it's not fear, because they were both calm in the presence of the officers. And it wasn't to get away, because at that point they knew what I knew when the feds came through my front door. There's no escape. That leaves only one logical reason to step on the accelerator. It's the same reason the officer fired. Oh, but she was scared. Specious. That's not what happened. It's what they want you to think. Why? Because Other leftists can continue acting the fool to stop law enforcement from removing illegal aliens who vote Democrat. It's not an explanation. It's a manipulation. It's an excuse. Let me get personal again. 5 months is the amount of time between when my picture came up on the FBI's most wanted site and the day I was arrested. During that time, do you think I had a normal life? No, I barely left my home. I was afraid of being run up by the feds while I was grocery shopping or going to church. Every morning, I would go to my front window and peek through the blinds and count the number of cars parked on the street, taking note of their make and model. When I did leave home, I constantly looked over my shoulder. I was scared. I was scared of the feds. I didn't go out of my way to force an interaction with them and showcase my breezy bravado. It's okay, dude. The way I acted was consistent with how someone who fears federal law enforcement behaves. Let's look at history. Oskar Schindler, the protagonist from the movie Schindler's List, which is based on a true story. How did he help the Jews? Did he walk up to the SS and suggest they get a sandwich and didn't care if they knew his face? Did he make it clear that he disagreed with their actions and was actively trying to thwart them? Oskar Schindler behaved in a manner that was consistent with someone who recognized the threat posed by the Nazi regime. Nazi is what they call the Trump regime. So why don't they act like Oskar Schindler? Why don't they act like I did? Did the goods act in a manner that was consistent with their stated motivations and so-called beliefs? The whole reason they were there in the first place, ostensibly, was to resist a tyrannical regime. The same regime that Democrats in the media have been saying used ICE agents to disappear and somehow deport full-fledged citizens. Yet the actions taken by the goods were not consistent with their reason for interfering with law enforcement. That's a plot hole. And if they misrepresented their reason for being there in the first place, why would we accept their reason for trying to run over an ICE officer? Just like when I challenged the Biden DOJ's J6 narrative, all I'm doing is taking their words at face value. It was an insurrection. The bomb was real and capable of harming multiple people. MAGA represented an existential threat to the Republic. Okay, I listened to what they said, and I used my imagination to picture how they should have reacted, and then compared that to what actually happened. And that's where you find the plot holes. According to the goods, they were freedom fighters in a resistance movement, and then they became defiant and belligerent towards what they likened to the SS. And then suddenly, they became quaking and helpless victims. From before that day, throughout that day, they changed who they were according to the need of the moment. Like the goods, everything about the case, from the protests to the reactions, are merely performative. If they believed what they said, they would have acted in a manner consistent with those beliefs, like I did, like Oskar Schindler did, like Ashley Babbitt did. She too was a victim of police violence, but throughout the day, she was the same person. From start to bloody finish, Ashley was Ashley. The goods were not. They changed. They radically changed into different characters as the day progressed. I can imagine a prosecutor successfully using this very angle of attack against Rebecca Good in trial. That's a benefit of my take on leftist behavior. It explains and presents a predictive model. It also does not strip the goods of their personal agency and individual morality. But most of all, it's not a psychological theory, but a tactical assessment. And because of that, it provides us with a workable and effective counter to the leftist tendency to force us to LARP in their perpetual fan fictions. Looking at these motivations and not being sidetracked by their questionable mental condition, this plot hole theory accounts for a number of traits unique to leftists, to include lying, hypocrisy, disinformation, appeal to emotion, the software updates where they randomly change what triggers them, associating trans with Muslim because of their love of personal license, which is why they do what they do. They just want to have freedom to do whatever. Inwardly main character energy while outwardly behaving like broken NPCs, like, an expert who doesn't know how to define what a woman is or can't say if a man can get pregnant. Their love of censorship is a projection of their own take on speech, which is that they weaponize it. So they love to censor because they see speech as not an exchange of ideas, but as a weapon. So of course they censor. They have a total disinterest in debate because speech is a form of manipulation and it's never been about idea sharing. They have an immunity to cognitive dissonance because they don't use logic. They just are lying. They have a strong, the Democrats have a strong party appeal to women, and the communication habits among the female of the species tends to be more emotional and more manipulative. They have a strong party appeal to criminals, deviants, and experts who are constantly seeking to leverage their positions in order to exercise more power over others. That's essentially what a Democrat is in the United States today. Plot hole theory also relieves conservatives of certain assumptions that impede rational and just reaction to leftist ploys. One is that we assume people have core beliefs and then structure their reasoning around those beliefs. We look at leftism as an ideology and intone seriously about the flaws of Marxism, atheism, materialism, utilitarianism, and so forth. This has been like a major focus of my research over these past few years. The left does not operate at an ideological level at all. That's the truth. Ideological people would actually yearn for debate over street combat, especially if they were that small. All they care about is being left alone to do what they want, no matter the consequences. That is the assumption, the means, and the object of all that they do. Hence, the appeals to truth, reason, consistent logic, morality, or common sense have no impact, and they never will have an impact. They know they aren't being sincere from the start, and they don't care. Just because the left frames everything in narratives, which they themselves don't rationally agree with, doesn't mean that we have to play along. In their minds, we may be characters in their stories, but they don't control what we say or do. We're the ones with the pens of our own lives. We can just as easily summon up our own main character energy. And our best way to counter them is to ruin their story by running right up to their fourth wall and break it, preferably with maximum consequences like what will happen to Rebecca Good when her case finally goes to trial. This assessment doesn't necessarily invalidate those other models, like I said, saying that leftists are 4 layers of crazy or have completely broken minds that are, operating like LLMs. Attacking the plot holes hits leftists right in their narratives. It exposes them as callous, manipulative phonies whose only real goal is getting license to do whatever they want and live without consequences. We don't need to navel gaze about their psychological state or how they've rewired their brains. Consequences like prison and lost prestige will leer them real quick. Their ploys will no longer act as a smokescreen for bad behavior, but as a signal flare that they're the real villains. Not in their story, of course, but in the only narrative that really matters, the story that is true.